The story of Upbuild began in a monastery. On our quest to understand ourselves more deeply, we recognize that it is our attachment to our egos, our identities, that gets in the way of being our true selves. This podcast will help you understand your ego. It will help you better understand your inner world, the motivations, insecurities, and emotions that affect your every action and relationship. Welcome to Upbuilding the Self. Hi, everyone. I'm Vipin, and I'm here with my partners, Prasada and Rasanath. How are you both doing?
Very good. Very good. We're excited to be here together and for a subject that is most central to our work.
Likewise.
Yeah, exactly. Let me introduce that subject. A few months ago, my brother Jay called me to talk about the latest podcast episode, the latest Upbuild podcast episode that he had just listened to. And he was enjoying the podcast and had listened to every episode thus far. And he had a question. We talk a lot about the ego, and we also talk a lot about the self, which is covered by the ego. But it felt to him that almost everything that we reference, motivations, goals, achievements, aspirations, emotions, are all part of the ego. So his question was, then what is left for the self? And I really appreciated his question. And I thought, if an intelligent person like my brother has listened to all of the episodes of our podcast and still isn't clear about what is the ego versus what is the self, then we definitely need to record an episode focusing exclusively on this topic. And who better to pose these questions to than the two of you, two former monks who have spent much of your lives working to understand the ego and realize the self that the ego is covering. With that introduction, let's start with one of my brother's questions. Why does it feel like everything we talk about is part of the ego?
Why it feels like everything we talk about is part of the ego is because that's the familiar. That's the world that we know. That's everything in our present experience. And until we actually get to the self, that's the default. And hardly anybody gets to that point because we don't spend enough time cultivating this understanding and the practice that will bring us to live that understanding, where we can really live as the self rather than as the ego. So everything that we see is through the lens of the ego. Everything we think is through the lens of the ego. Everything we feel is through the lens of the ego. How does this affect me? How does it affect me? How does it affect me? Even when I do things for other people, how does that affect me? Am I happy about it? Am I not happy about it? It's all the ego. That's the only world we know until we venture out of Plato's cave, so to speak. And we talk about this a lot in our Bhagavad Gita course, The Call to Awaken. And we explore uncharted territory. And that's really what we're here to do, is to recognize the limits of our present paradigm, our present world, which is only the ego, and to start to creep outside into that uncharted territory outside of Plato's cave. And for many people, that is a challenge because, well, this is the familiar, and this is empirically what I understand to be true. And what about the rest of it? It feels so distant and foreign, and like, how am I ever going to get there? Do I even believe in that? So that's where we stand.
Very helpful. So you're saying, if I were to think about how wide is the ego's domain in my life, it's as wide as my life. And if I were to ask, does it govern everything in my human experience? You would say, yes, absolutely. It governs everything that I experience because I'm viewing everything through the lens of my ego.
Yes, yes. Until we decide otherwise and we put our money where our mouth is. That requires practice and diligence, vigilance to cultivate the life of the real self by understanding what is distinct. And so it may be helpful to emphasize the definition of what the ego is, which is, according to our understanding and experience at Upbuild, we coin the ego as an identity of who we think we should be rather than who we are. An identity of who we think we should be rather than who we are. So we're always trying to become something, always trying to envision ourselves a certain way and get validation for that from the world, prove to ourselves, project things, defend things. That's the constant realm that we're in. And until we step outside of that, that's the full landscape of our possibilities. And it's quite narrow.
The identity of who I think I should be versus who I really am. So my question is, what is the difference between those two things? What is the difference between who I think I should be versus who I really am?
Part of the reason why responding to this question is very complex is because it happens in a very subtle realm. It's happening in a very subtle way. The best way I can try to articulate it is when we are sleeping at night and we are seeing a dream, how would we know whether the dream is a dream or is it real? If we experience the dream in such a real way, at that point in time, when we are actually dreaming, when we are sleeping, it's impossible for us to know that there is a reality that exists beyond the dream, right? So if I were to draw that parallel to the real self and the ego, it is so hard to even explain what the real self is if we haven't actually even started to wake up. And to me, the waking up process begins when I see how much my behavior is actually coming from a place of fear and scarcity, more than a place of abundance and life. And when I can draw my attention to that, that's when I begin to ask this question, well, something doesn't fit right here. And that's where the waking up process starts, where we start to notice the difference. Just like how when you're having a really bad dream and you're experiencing the dream, this has happened to me every single time, that when I go through a very bad dream, somehow it forces me to wake up from the dream. Or that someone outside recognizes that I'm actually suffering in a dream and wakes me up. So that's a very similar experience when we go through the suffering that is actually created by our egoic behavior. We don't even know at that point in time that it is egoic behavior. But when that suffering is experienced in a very deep way, and we really start to think about that, is when we start to distinguish, okay, there's something here that's not quite right. And that's when the waking up process starts. And at least when the waking up process starts, I begin to recognize with more conviction that what I'm doing and what I'm experiencing, there's something not completely real about it. And that is what begins the process of separation from the ego and the real self. We don't have a full conception of what the real self is. Just like how when we are still waking up, when we are in that in-between state, when we are dreaming and like we are waking up from sleep, it's like something is not right about this. And then the waking up process starts. It's just like that. That is why in so much of our work, we talk about self-awareness and talk about recognizing that we are living in a dream.
I was also just thinking with that metaphor of the dreaming state, how confronting it is if you extrapolate that, because you mentioned somebody can wake you up from that suffering. But if somebody wakes me up, even if I'm having a nightmare, I'm not happy about that. I'm angry, right? And there's something to that. It's like, no, let me be in my nightmare. Let me be in my dreaming state. Now, of course, the reason why I'm really angry is because I need a certain amount of sleep. But the interesting thing is that we think the same is true for the ego, that I need a certain amount of ego, or I need a certain amount of being plugged into material existence, to the ego world. And if you confront that, that's not good. I don't welcome that. And I speak, from my own experience as before entering monastic life, I didn't want anything to do with any monks or any people that had a different paradigm. I didn't like it.
It's also really hard to show someone what the real world is in their dream. And many times the question, no, I want you to show me in my dream what the real world is. Otherwise, I'm not making up. But it creates sort of a paradox here where it is hard to actually really see what the real world is until I start to wake up from the dream.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So I asked this question, what is the difference between who I think I should be versus who I really am? And you're sharing the metaphor of the dream, which I'm interpreting as it is hard to know who I really am because I'm in the dream state of who I think I should be. So all I know is who I think I should be. And so it's hard for you to describe in words the difference between that and who I think I am, because everything I'm seeing, again, to share back what Hari Prasad said at the beginning, is through the lens of the ego. So you're drawing this distinction between who I think I should be versus who I really am, but it may not be so easy to understand who I really am as long as I keep looking at it through the lens of the ego.
Here is the tricky thing, right? When you're talking about the ego and saying the ego is what I think I should be, we are not even saying it in that way. We are actually saying, this is who I am.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? This is who I am. And what really starts to create the challenge is, if this is really who I am, then why am I afraid?
Right.
And to me, that's where the waking up starts. So the conflation of our identity, where when we think we should be something, but we actually look at that as like, well, this is who I am, and it's just time separating. Other people will see it, or I will see it, but I know this is who I am. Well, if we know it, then when something happens that sort of contradicts it, why are we so afraid? And to me, that is the gap that we really have to look at. The insecurities around that, the fears around that.
It's interesting. This is something that I've been writing a lot about on this book project. I'm working on a book project around the personality typology, the Enneagram, that helps to really personalize the understanding of the ego and the journey to the real self. And one of the things that became apparent I'm learning so much through the process. It's amazing. And one of the things that became very apparent is we are starting with this idea of I am a certain way, I should be a certain way. And that, interestingly, is based on things that are true, in the sense of like, I know when I can offer my good qualities and there's a purity to that experience. I know it. It's like, that feels freeing. That feels really beautiful. But I'm afraid that I'm not able to access that enough because I'm not. So then I want to become something based on that. And I'm afraid of not being that, right? And then I start to concoct it and contort it. And then the next step is what you're describing, which is, well, I am this because I have to be. Otherwise, what will my identity be? So I am this. And we call that the primary story to defend. The primary story to defend. Because now I have this story of who I think I should be, and I'm clinging to it. This is going to be my identity. This is me, and I am this. And if you make me think or feel anything that is not consistent with that, it's very threatening, and I have to defend it. So that is the primary story to defend. I am my ego, and we all walk around with that all the time. I am this. I am that. Make sure that I feel that.
Okay, so there's so much here. If I think about who I think I should be myself, or as Rasanath said, even who I think I am, is how we might think about it as individuals. When I think I should be kind, is that my ego talking?
It's a great question.
Yeah. This speaks exactly to what we were talking about with this sort of, There's something pure in me that's related to the self, and then it gets refracted through the ego, and then it becomes the deep fear that drives my life. And then it becomes, no, I am this, the primary story to defend. So if you trace it back, there is something about the real self that's present in that. The real self is kind, and we intuitively know that, and we want to experience that. But the problem is, because we're governed by the ego, because we have not actually extricated it, it is going through the channel that it has to go through, the ego. So then it gets warped. It goes through a distorted lens, and it's tinted. So now it's like, look at how kind I am. Aren't I such a good person? I feel really good about myself. You should want to be in my company. I just gave a lot in charity. I am really liked by my friends. I do things that make me feel really fulfilled in my life. And it's all me, 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 me. But I don't know this, because the talk track is, look at what I'm doing for the world. Like, that's good. That's great. And if you want to criticize that, there are so many more things you should be criticizing. Look at all the bad in the world. Look at all the evil. I'm good. But it's the root cause is the ego, and it's taking something from the self and it's distorting it and making it me-centered, and it's making me suffer like anything. And to varying degrees of proximity to the real self, this is also what we're talking a lot about in the book, that my level of consciousness or my level of health is defined by how closely I identify with the ego versus the self. So there's a spectrum. So if I'm really trying to just be the kindest person I can possibly be, but all I know is the ego, then I'm relatively much closer to the self, and I have a leg up. Whereas if I just feel brutalized by life and everyone should suffer what I've gone through, and I'm going to take my power back, and you're going to see, you're going to pay, then I am as far away from the self as I can be. And there's everything in between.
Kindness is actually an expression, a natural expression of the real self. And when the egoic self steps in, it uses kindness to reinforce its identity. See the shift in it. Like, I am kind to somebody else because then I receive the validation for kindness, versus I am kind to somebody else because that's just a natural expression of who I am. And that is the distinction between the real self and the false self. The real self is free from, when I'm kind to somebody, I'm not really thinking about, well, did that person really recognize that I'm kind or not? Like, was my kindness short because nobody said anything about it? Suddenly my act of kindness becomes a means for me to reinforce my identity, versus my act of kindness actually being a free expression of the self.
It's not self-referential anymore. The kindness of the real self doesn't need that self-obsession. It's really about the other person. And I may feel really excited to serve the other person. So it's not like I negate my own experience. It's not that I have no place to play in this. But the excitement is about the other person exclusively. And, well, I shouldn't say exclusively, and also just the ability to be an instrument in that person's life. And the honor, I feel so touched. It's such an honor to be of that genuine service.
So you're saying, when I say I think I am a kind person, that the nature of the self is kindness. So I actually am kind, but the fear, Rasanath, you were talking about, if I actually am that thing, then where's there a place for fear? So the problem is I am actually kind, but I'm not in touch with that self. I'm not actually in touch with that nature. And so I'm out there to prove I am kind. And that needing to prove is coming from my ego, which is then fearful that something I do or say or in the way it's received is not considered kind. And all of a sudden, I am not this thing that I think I should be.
Just to perhaps refine that understanding a little bit, the ego essentially can only manufacture from what is true. So, for example, when you see a real flower, there is a certain quality about it. There is a certain texture, there's a certain color, there's a certain smell. And when you see something real, you actually see, okay, this is a flower. The ego, what it does, takes that idea and basically says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to manufacture 10 different kinds of this and sell it. Because based on how much it sells, I know that I have this. So while the expression from the ego is still based on the real existence of something, it's not the real thing anymore. It's manufactured, right? And even in our world, in our material life, we can actually draw the distinction between, when something is manufactured and something is artificial. And even from a distance, it may look like the real thing. And when I come close, I see, well, it doesn't have the same qualities as the real thing, right? So that's how we see, when we see things in this world that are refracted through the ego, it's still wanting. Now, many times we justify, well, something is better than nothing. We say that. And that's true. That is true to some extent. But then we short sell ourselves. We've settled to living with artifice from a point of view of saying, well, living with artifice is at least better than living with nothing. But in some ways, it actually creates more suffering.
I was going to share something very similar just to really nail this down. The self is providing the content. It's feeding the content of what is valuable. And then that is being transmitted through the ego. So that's being fed through the ego, and then it comes out as something completely different. And that's where all inner and outer conflict comes from. It's that transmission from the real self through the lens of the ego where it gets muddied. And now it doesn't have the same quality, just as you were talking about, Rasanath. It's something else. And in varying degrees of proximity to the real self, as we were talking about. So sometimes it smells good, it tastes good. Sometimes it's horrible, it's disastrous.
It's also very interesting to compare this to light. And, for those of us who have some engineering, scientific background, we actually see that light of different colors are essentially certain frequencies. So you say, well, there's a green light. But when you talk about light doesn't have a green property to it. It has a frequency. Now, what happens is when all other frequencies are filtered out, you only see one. That's sort of the distortion that happens through the ego. You just see something of the real thing, but it's not the real thing. But the important thing here, the clue to the real thing is still in the something. And this is where we don't really, like, what we do is we either settle for the real thing or give up on the real thing, because we're either frustrated. It's frustration. The seeking of the real complete thing never stops, never ceases. You're always looking for the next. Whether we are the most successful person in the world, whether we have the best family and all the life that we really want to live, we're still looking for something more. It leaves us wanting. And to me, that is where the clue is. Like, why? And we don't really take the time to think about that wanting. We either, as I said, we either give up on it or we settle.
How do you know that's not just the desire for progress, inherent desire to keep moving forward and getting better, and that's human nature?
To me, when we say that's human nature, it's a great question. And when we say that's human nature, what is the notion of progress? Why does it even live in human nature, right? And for me, when we talk about progress, this goes back to what we say. I have some notion that there is a destination. Otherwise, I wouldn't even talk about, I can just say, well, this is it. I've reached why is there even a sense of gap?
So you're saying progress for the sake of progress itself without an ultimate destination doesn't make any sense.
How do you even measure progress, right? You only say, well, I'm better than what I was before. But how do you even know that there is a better that exists? Or even have a notion of there is a better that exists? Where is the drive? Where is that innate drive for a sense of where is the sense of better even coming from? Very existential.
Right. So where are you saying it's coming from?
that's the clue to the real self. It is so interesting. The paradox of progress is I want to become better, but at the same time, I also feel like there is a state where I will feel like fully arrived. And that's the paradox here. Like, it's not like, well, it's just, I'll just keep moving and moving and moving, and there is no end to it.
So the idea is that the self is complete.
Yes.
And the ego is trying to catch up with that reality. So the notion of progress is based on, even when it's unconscious or subconsciously, trying to get to the self.
That's right. That's right. And the ego is not necessarily trying to get to the self. The ego is being a proxy for the self. Right? The ego is basically saying, well, in the absence of not being able to experience the self, like, okay, I'll stand in. And suddenly now we are asking for the ego to be the real self, which it will never be able to fulfill. And it's doing its best.
I might speak in a little bit harsher terms here, that the ego is actually suffocating the self, and it's threatened by the self. So even though the self is providing the content, it's like, okay, I'll take that. Thank you very much. I'll take that. Great. It's mine. I got it. And it's actually creating so much pain for the self. It's the prison. And until the ego is removed, the self suffers alone forever.
I see this as an example. But I see my daughter, when I play music on the mridanga, she listens to the music and she gets very excited because the beats roll in a certain way. And she'll come to me and say, I want to play. Right. So I'll tell her, well, sure, but I will teach you how to play this. She'll say, no, I want to do it myself. What's in her mind is the music, and she sees the movement of my hands, and she thinks that by moving the hands that looks something like that, the same kind of. And then what happens is she gets frustrated because it doesn't sound like when I play it. She gets very frustrated by it. And I say, you learn and you. So you see how she wants to get there. She wants to get there. But it takes learning and shedding certain things to actually truly get there. This is the relationship between the ego and the real self, right? The ego basically say, oh, okay, I'm going to do it now. I'm going to do it. And it'll feel so, but it never quite get there. And then the ego is frustrated and it's trying to say, okay, when I do more and I do the same thing more and do it even much bigger way, I think, but again, doesn't happen.
That's great. By the way, the mridanga is this traditional Indian instrument that's a double-headed drum that you can play, like Rasanath was saying.
Thank you.
So how do you know if motivation for a goal or an achievement is being driven by the ego or the self? Are we saying it's always driven by the ego until we are sort of a self-realized person?
Yeah, the ego has two functions: to control and to enjoy. That's what it's all about. That's the whole game. Control and enjoy. And the greatest experience of that control and enjoyment is when I feel like, aha, now I am what I set out to be. It culminates in identity. That's why the ego is an identity. But the way that it functions is controlling and enjoying. So I will cultivate this experience for myself, and it will be so wonderful. And I will bring all these other people together, or I will be alone in peace away from the world, and I will then enjoy. And it's all controlling and enjoying. But when we think about control and enjoyment, we think about dictators, or we think about hedonists, people who are on the extreme end of the spectrum. We don't realize. This is like Gabor Mate. I always quote his beautiful TED Talk, The Power of Addiction, the Addiction of Power. He states that we take this us and them approach to addicts. We think like, oh, those miserable, unfortunate other people. And yes, they're more unfortunate. Yes, they deserve more compassion in certain ways. But what we're missing is we're just like them. just not as extreme, not as gross. We're all addicts of different kinds. And the addiction is to fill the void in the heart. And he talks about this. And this is what we're talking about here, why we're never satiated, why progress, but we never arrive. There's this void in the heart. And so we try to fill that by controlling and enjoying. And we try to do it in very decent ways, in very human ways. We try to do it in ways that will allow other people to control and enjoy also. But what we do in the process is we lose ourselves, and we create a hall of mirrors where everyone can lose themselves so that you can be a happy person walking around this world who is completely feeling that void and driven by that void and only knows the ego when the real self is left undiscovered.
To your question, Vipin, when we first starting to talk about this topic, I mentioned how it's such a subtle, it is a very subtle subject, the ego versus the real self. And the nature of the world, what we have been educated with, the paradigms that we live in and the information that we have immersed ourselves in don't really render themselves to that kind of subtlety. And what is interesting is our methods and our senses, our faculties have not yet been trained to understand the subtlety and to be introspective, really be able to go into these subtle levels of understanding existentially how we live our day-to-day life. And to me, the process of really starting to distinguish only begins when we step into the ring. We have to ask ourselves and really pursue certain questions very, very diligently, which either because of time constraints, which I completely understand, or the busyness of life, or the effort that's required to go inwards, we just don't do it. But to me, anything that is serious, if we are seriously pursuing something, we have seen it in our own lives, we actually take the time to learn. And my guru's guru would always give this example that if you have to separate a real diamond from a fake diamond, you have to get trained by someone who really understands gems. There are people in this world who can actually just see a real diamond in the light and be able to say what is real from what's fake. But they have gone through years of training and practice to be able to locate things in that level of subtlety. And it's possible. We can actually do it. There are people who actually teach that. But it's important for us to become students of the self. And that is the first step in walking from the ego to the real self, because the ego is always projecting, I know myself. And the first step in walking towards the real self is the ego being able to admit, I don't know what the real self is. I have been pretending in some ways. And when that happens, then we come into what we call the student mindset. And that then makes it possible over time to start distinguishing between the false self, the ego, and the real self.
So if we want to understand if our motivation is coming from the ego or the self, first we need to make very clear the concept of both. And then we have to start to fill in those concepts with experiences. We have to actually practice removing the layers of the ego and studying the nature of the self and seeing it play out in other people who are realizing the self by identifying with that, not acting on the ego, and seeing it in our own selves where we are removing those propensities to control and enjoy. And we're actually, this is very subtle, but we're actually using those for the purpose of the real self. In other words, what does control and enjoyment look like when it's not the addiction that's coming from the void in the heart? It means I put together an experience so that other people can discover who they really are, and it's not about me. Has nothing to do with my ego. I'm just doing whatever little is within my power to control for that purpose. It's not about control. It's purely in service. I'm controlling, but it's not about control. And I'm enjoying, but it's not about enjoyment. At the end of the day, you could say, ultimately, it is about enjoyment because the real self is fully happy as can be beyond our wildest imagination. And that's why we're seeking out all the thrills and pleasures and, love and connections that make us heartwarmed and happy, in our ego lives. So in a way, you could say it is about enjoyment, but it's so different. It's not about when I get what's mine. It has nothing to do with that. I want everyone to experience that enjoyment. I don't care about my own enjoyment so much as I care about all of us realizing who we are and being connected on that level. That's how we can distinguish what our motivation is. It requires, as Rasanath said, first being a student of the real self and doing the hard work, the practice, the most rewarding and exciting work there is of removing the ego and investing in who we are.
Wow, I really appreciate all of this. And I know we need to wrap up here, even though I have many, many more questions on this topic. So we'll have to have another part. But to just close today, I want to ask you a final question, which is, what's at stake if we don't just make this distinction? Because sometimes I may be doing something and maybe there's some pure motivations from the self, and maybe I'm also enjoying some of it for my ego's enjoying it as well. And I mean, is it so important to disentangle those things?
A life less lived. It's the best way I can put it. When you see someone, and this is true, I've also felt this, when we live our lives short of what is actually possible, when we settle, there's a certain tragic nature to it. And to me, that's the price we pay. It's a life not fully lived. And the result of that life not fully lived is that invariably, to various degrees, will cause suffering to us, to other people. So I don't really see an option.
It's remaining in the darkness of Plato's cave, never knowing that there's something else beyond it. That is the undiscovered potential here that we are not tapping into. And it may seem innocent. Oh, I'm a good person. I'm doing good things. Yeah, there may be some tinge. Yeah, I may not know exactly the real self, the full self that you're talking about. I don't even know if I believe in that. But that's what we're missing, is the possibility to experience something that is so far beyond, something so powerful that we're all hankering for all the time at every moment.
And to go back to Rasanath's earlier metaphor, to wake up from the dream, to awaken. Thank you both. This was incredibly enlivening, and we're still just scratching the surface here. So for sure to be continued. But I so appreciate all of your wisdom and your insight and your genuineness. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vipin. Thank you, Rasanath.
Thank you so much, Vipin. And thanks to Jay for bringing out these amazing, wonderful questions, deep questions.
And thanks to everyone else listening as well.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Upbuilding the Self. Upbuild is a leadership development company that offers workshops, coaching, and other services to help you on the path towards being your best self, free from the shackles of the ego. To learn more about our work, visit our website, upbuild.com, and sign up for our newsletter to gain access to podcasts, reflections, and upcoming events. If you enjoyed this episode, please go to iTunes to leave us a review so that others can find and benefit from the podcast. We look forward to being with you again next time.